Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Chris Mitchell, Chief Technology Officer here at Inflow Communications, and I'll be leading today's webinar. We'll be talking about SIP trunking, and if you haven't had a chance to hit our website and look for upcoming webinars, I think they're getting ready to add the July webinars on there, but we have one more webinar coming up this month on Bright Metrics, so Bright Metrics 101. So if you have access to Bright Metrics or maybe you want to learn a little bit more, it'll be a great session next week around Bright Metrics. Quick agenda, I'll just talk a couple minutes on who is Inflow Communications, and then I'll jump right into SIP and the Mitel ShoreTel system. And then I'll save a little bit of time for question and answer and the contact us at the end. If you have questions, feel free to post them in the questions section. I'll try to answer them on each slide as I go. Usually I can answer most of the questions just with my presentation, but I'll save a little time at the end in case we have any questions I didn't answer during the presentation. All right, so who's Inflow Communications? We're unified communications and contact center company. That's all we do. We don't try to play in the contact or in the IT space, or carrier spaces, stuff like that. We're a Mitel ShoreTel Platinum partner, which is the highest level. We're a Ring Central delivery partner and a Genesis Pure Cloud Gold partner. So the highest tiers on each of those. So we don't do a ton of different products, but the ones we do, we have the highest certification and partnership levels with those companies. So we have employees in 10 states, actually soon to be 11 states. We have one employee relocating to a new state that we're not in currently. Over 250,000 endpoints worldwide and 800 customers, with all US-based headquarters, but then offices spread out throughout the world even. We're maniacal about customer experience, so you can hit our website, see our stats. We post comments, about our surveys to our customers, about our employees and everything. Our customers span all kinds of different verticals, and sizes and everything like that. These are just a few of our, I would say bigger, well-known customers. All right, so we're going to hop right in here. So we're going to start off talking just about in general about SIP trunking, and then we'll get into the specifics around the ShoreTel Mitel system, depending on if you have older 13 or 14 version of ShoreTel or the Mitel Connect platforms. We'll kind of talk through the ins and outs of utilizing SIP trunking on that platform. So the first thing, when we're talking to customers, I talk to a ton of customers about SIP trunking. Is they'll ask me, why should I move to SIP, or my carrier wants me to get off my copper PRIs, and what are the benefits of it, or why should I be looking at it? So in the diagram here, you can kind of see on the left-hand side is your traditional kind of PRIs, where you have a separate PRI going to each location. On the right side, you have SIP trunking, where you have SIP trunking come into a carrier's, the ITSP cloud there. And then once the calls hit that SIP trunking, then they can distribute them to whatever locations that you want. So you get some flexibility. You can buy DIDs in multiple markets. Like in our case, for marketing purposes and stuff like that, we want to have, some local phone numbers in different markets. So I think I own phone numbers in 30 markets, so the customers can call local support number, or something like that if they want to. You can also port numbers from multiple markets. You don't necessarily have to have a physical presence, in a market, or maybe you don't need physical dial tone for a small office. And with SIP trunking, you could buy phone numbers in Chicago, even though you don't have dial tone in Chicago, and just provide it, dial tone via one of your other locations to that, to that office. A lot of carriers with SIP give you caller ID customization. So we have customers that are like BPOs, and maybe they need to send one caller ID name out, for calls with this phone number, but different caller ID names out for, for different DIDs, and you have flexibility typically on this, on the SIP platforms to do that. The other nice thing is it's not location specific. When you get a PRI, you can only, buy phone numbers that are associated with that rate center. But also becomes a lot harder for, for failover and stuff like that, because everything is physically tied to a physical location where the copper is connected. So from a disaster recovery perspective, you get geographic redundancy. So as your SIP carrier is providing SIP trunking maybe to your office in, in Phoenix and Dallas and LA, as a call comes in, if one of those sites dial tone goes down, the system will say, oh, I can automatically fail the calls that were supposed to go to Phoenix, over to our circuit in LA, or internet or dial tone in LA, and then LA can just send that call back across your internet connection to Phoenix. Voila, that all happens automatic, rather than manual ticket creation, stuff like that, when you typically have a regular copper PRI with most carriers. The other nice thing for disaster recovery is you have a nice web portal. For most of the carriers that are on SIP now, you have a nice web portal where I can log in and say, oh, this phone number should fail over to this site as a primary failover, this site is a secondary failover, and this cell phone number is a third level failover. So you can typically do 3 levels of failover with most SIP providers. So first, Phoenix goes down, the first failover is LA, the second failover, is Dallas, and the third failover is, a cell phone number for that, for that user's DID, or, for the office manager or something like that. Scalability is another big reason that we talk about SIP with the customers. Is when you get a PRI, you got to get a 23-channel PRI in most cases. Some carriers would give you a half, but it's pretty rare. So with scalability, you can say, oh, I just need 5 SIP trunks for this office. The smaller office, let's start off with 5 SIP trunks, and then as that office grows, I can go from 5 to 10 to to 20 to 50 as needed. So you can increment in smaller amounts. And adding the sessions is significantly easier than than ordering a new PRI or anything like that. Typically, you could submit an order with the carrier and say, yeah, I need to add additional SIP trunks, and some carriers will actually add them same day. Most of them is within 2 to 3 days they'll get the trunks added. So significantly faster than most of the older carriers. From a cost savings perspective, SIP now is, in some cases it's a lot less expensive. In most cases, it's comparable. PRI prices have came down in most cases, so PRI and SIP is a little bit closer from a cost perspective. A lot of time you will save more on long distance or toll-free rates with SIP though, unless you have a really good rate with a carrier because you do a lot of business with them. In most cases, you will have a slight cost savings, not a ton. You used to be able to save a lot more money going from a PRI to SIP. If you have an area that's kind of more remote, a lot of time there's a local loop charge for the PRI that makes that PRI more expensive because it's kind of farther out, and there could be some significant cost savings if you had higher loop charges from on your PRIs to go over to SIP. So those are kind of the main reasons that customers are choosing SIP now, and I would say the biggest reason is disaster recovery, being able to fail over calls between multiple sites. If the cost is similar, that's great. If it's cheaper, that's even better. But most customers are really looking at for disaster recovery perspective. All right, so now we're going to jump into a couple slides around SIP requirements. So this is typically where it comes to SIP. Oh, it's a great idea. Okay, well, how do I make it work on my system? So the first thing almost every carrier is going to require connecting to your ShoreTel Mitel system is a session border controller. I was just looking at the Mitel Solution Alliance, I think is what it's called now, where they have all the certified SIP providers and SBCs, and I only saw a few carriers who don't require a session border control. They have certified that with a native SIP integration, and there was just a few of them. So almost everyone is going to require a session border controller to do translation. That session border controller could be something that you own, you purchase, or something that the carrier is providing you, just renting. That's the recommended solution, is let the carrier provide it. It's one less piece of equipment that you have to maintain. That you have, if it fails, you got to worry about ordering it and getting a replacement. And while that replacement's getting done, you're without dial tone. So if the carrier owns it, it goes down, they'll dispatch an engineer technician to your office, and they'll swap it out same day for you. So if carrier can provide it, I would highly recommend it. Codec is another thing we have to take into account. Codec is how much bandwidth and what type of authentication and encryption or compression we're going to use on that call. So most carriers and SBCs support G711 and G729. Those are kind of the most common codecs that are fully supported on the ShoreTel Mitel system as well. The G711 codec is a 64K codec, so each call uses about 80 kilobytes worth of bandwidth at a time. on that connection. So when you have a SIP trunks coming in and out, they're monitored in bandwidth now. No longer, yeah, you have concurrent calls, but you need to make sure you have enough bandwidth to account for the codec that we're using. So we want to make sure that the codecs that we're using in the phone system are the same codecs that have been selected and set up in the session border controller. That way we don't have one of them compressing to G729 every time and one of them decompressing it back to G711. It just puts more work and more load on the session border controller in your short gear switches. So, and then like I said, if you have 50 concurrent SIP sessions times 80K, you want to make sure that you have at least 5 megabits of bandwidth or something like that from the carrier on that SIP service if they're bringing in a dedicated connection. You can also just use your own internet connection for SIP, as well. So we just want to make sure we have enough bandwidth to accommodate the number of SIP sessions we're going to be running. When you're talking, internet networking, there's kind of two things to really consider about how you are bringing in your SIP trunks. Are you going to have a circuit provided by the carrier, like I was talking about, or are you just going to use your own internet? If you want guaranteed quality of service, the only way to get guaranteed quality of service on a SIP provider is to have the carrier bring in the internet connection that the SIP is on. If they bring it in, they'll guarantee you quality of service of 99% per year. Sometimes that's not cost effective because they want to charge for that data circuit and everything else, so there's another charge for that. So a lot of customers are going to just providing SIP trunking over their current internet. And there's a couple ways you can do that to make it still give you some quality of service, not necessarily a guarantee, but to kind of help with with quality of services. One, you can have a dedicated connection, just internet that you only use for SIP. You could do load balancing or SD-WAN. So if your router supports internet load balancing, or you put in an SD-WAN solution, that can allow the router or the SD-WAN solution to kind of monitor circuits and pick which internet connection they should send that particular call out of. And that's what most of our customers are doing as they're going to SIP. They're not going the dedicated connection from the carrier because it's just too expensive. That's what they're trying to get away from. So a lot of them customers are going to SD-WANs or just redundant internet connections, where they can, let their routers do load balancing for them. So that's the most common. And what we're seeing, like, when I talk to customers about that from a call quality perspective, is they don't get the QoS guarantee of 99 from the carrier, but they're seeing like 95%, call quality on their calls. So for the few percent less, they're saving a significant portion, amount of money. So in most cases, it's worth it to the customer to not bring in a dedicated connection. The other thing we have to take into account is when we're using a session border controller is depending on how that session border controller is coming in and out of your network to the phone system, we need to make sure that, firewall rules and network routing rules and stuff like that are set up properly so that, sometimes firewalls will be inspecting the SIP traffic, and that'll actually delay the packets and cause them call quality issues because the firewall is slowing it down by doing its stateful inspection of packets or something like that. So sometimes we got to tweak how the firewalls are being applied, or rules are being applied to SBC traffic. The other thing we got to take into account is E911. So, there's a lot of new E911 laws that, that are rolling out this year and next year, and we got to make sure we can take those into account, and we can accommodate, 911 addressing and notifications with SIP trunking. So if you have users working at home, it makes it a little bit harder, but what we can do is if you have permanent work at home users, you can register their DID with your carrier to have their home address for 911. So if they were to ever place a 911 call, from a physical phone or a soft phone connected to the ShoreTel Mitel system, their 911 address at their house will be sent out. So that's a fairly easy process with most carriers. The thing we have to take into account is if we're sharing dial tone between multiple locations and stuff like that, we just need to make sure we work with the carrier to make sure that each phone number has the correct address registered to it. And most SIP providers have a nice web portal you can log in and see that in now. So I can hop in and say, oh, each phone number, and here's the address registered for 911. We just want to make sure that that's set up properly. so that when a 911 call does go out, we don't dispatch emergency services to the wrong location. The last thing we have to take into account when we're talking SIP with a carrier is how many sessions they're going to provide to us, and then what does that look like from a hardware and licensing perspective on the ShoreTel Mitel system? Because we'll show it on I think the next slide. There's 12 different hardware options, to handle SIP trunking, but then we also need to take into account almost all of those hardware options also have a license, SIP licensing option that has to go with it. So we need to make sure that the hardware can support the number of sessions that we're gonna have on it, and then we get the right licensing in place for that. All right, so we'll talk hardware and kind of one of the biggest limitation around the hardware. So you can see here's all the different switch models going back to the SG30s. I didn't have the full width, the 40, the 60, or the 120 on here because those models have been officially discontinued. You can't move forward with those switches in your system anymore to the newer platform. So I pulled them off of this list and just left the ones that are currently available and currently supported. So if you notice on the first 5 switches, the SIP trunk capacity, it matches the number of IP phones that are supported on it. So SG30 or 50 can handle 30 or 50 trunks. But from a resource standpoint, there's a feature on these switches called SIP media proxy. So SIP trunk, they have like what they call their basic SIP trunk, and then they have their media proxy SIP trunks. Media proxy was introduced in like ShoreTel 13, and what it really does is it does any of the advanced features of a SIP call. So anytime we need to play music on hold or do a conference call with that or record the call, silent monitor, anything that they consider like an advanced feature of a call, then we need one of these ports on the right, the SIP media proxy ports. And there's a hardware limitation on the physical switches that limit the number of those media proxy ports that are available on each individual switch. And you're not necessarily going to play music on hold in every single call or record every single call in most cases. Some customers say they need to record every call, and it gets a little bit more difficult. But once music on hold or a call has started recording, it takes up one of these media proxy ports until the end of the call. So on an SG30, if we had, say, 30 SIP trunks coming into the system, only 3 of those calls at a time can be music on hold, could have played music on hold, recorded, or done a conference call at a time. Once the 4th person tries to put a user on hold, the customer is just going to hear dead air because it doesn't have a media proxy port to play that hold music. So that's one thing we got to take into account is try to figure out. Typically, what we recommend is like 1 in 4. Sometimes every 1 in 3, but like 1 in 4 ports should have a media proxy port. Unless you're going to do a lot of call recording, then we need to up that media proxy port. So a lot of time the older switches become a problem because if I'm going to do 50 SIP trunks and I can only have 6 media proxy ports, I might need to to be able to play or conference call or play hold music to more than the 6 calls at a time. If you go down to some of the newer switches, the ST switches, if you'll notice there, what they've done is they've just set it up as if you have 8 SIP trunks on a 50 and all 8 of them are media proxy ports. So what they've done is they've lowered the number of SIP trunks capacity on the newer switches, but they've made the media proxy ports equal so that every single call can play hold music or conference or something like that. So the new ST1D and 2D are kind of like the new PRI or SIP switches. You'll notice that they actually got they have a capacity of doing 30 or 60, and that's the ones we sell the most going forward. If someone's looking for a physical switch to do SIP trunking, the 1D and the 2D are kind of the most common physical switches. So everything down to the 2D on this list is the physical hardware, and they all need software licensing from ShoreTel Mitel in order to support SIP trunking as well. So we need to have the hardware capacity plus a SIP license to handle SIP trunking with any of the physical hardware switches. Once we go down to the virtual trunk switch on the bottom, if you're on 14.2, we can do that in VMware. We can spin up one of those Linux trunk switches. If you're on the new connector version already, you can do it in VMware or Hyper-V. And then we get a lot more flexibility because I can spin up a single image and go up to 1,000 trunks. Most customers don't go that high on one image, but every single trunk port can have a media proxy, and then it has a single license for that virtual trunk switch. That single license includes, the hardware capabilities and the SIP licensing capability, from ShoreTel Mitel. So typically easier to go with a virtual trunk switch if you have VMware or you're already on Connect, you have Hyper-V, because you have a lot more flexibility. And a lot of customers are trying to get away from physical hardware. So it's another way you can get away from physical hardware, running your PRIs and having a single point of failure there. Because you can spin up multiple virtual trunk switches and then tell your session border controller to kind of load balance, or have a primary and a backup virtual trunk switch, so you can give some redundancy to your SIP trunking internally. That's usually the most common area where we have some confusion, is those media proxy ports, and that's why when the newer switches came out, they just standardized them to make them equal, because a lot of people is like, well, why do I need those? Or trying to figure out how many media proxy ports you have is kind of a pain. And it's a best guess effort. There's no real way to look back and see a report saying, well, oh, you need 12 media proxy ports. There's no report that shows you how many calls were played hold music recorded, or is conference or silent monitor at the same time. So that's usually the biggest question mark for most customers. So the other thing we like to talk about when we're talking to customers is what issues are going to come up if you're converting from PRI over to SIP. What's kind of the gotchas that you should be aware of. So failure scenarios is typically the first thing we'll talk about. And with SIP, we have a higher rate of what they call like a partial failure. And with a partial failure, we have some issues that the ShoreTel Mitel system might not see the SIP trunking as actually failed when it actually has. So sometimes your ShoreGear switch that's talking to an SBC, that connection stays up. That SIP trunk connection stays up, and the Mitel system can see the SBC. So we still try to send calls to it because we think the session border controller is up and running perfectly. But on the other side, the session border controller has lost connection to the carrier from a SIP perspective. So anything we send to it is just failing. So that's considered a partial failure. A lot of time what we can do is we can fix that by having the carrier, or an engineer work with you on the SBC setup, and have it set up where if the SBC loses connection to the carrier, then it'll take down the connection to the phone system. And that in that case, we usually fix our partial failure issue, from the session border controller. But out of the box, that setting isn't set up in most cases on most SBCs. So it's like a custom thing that we typically want to test, and look at the setup on the SBC. The other thing we run into is the setup is most of the carriers are not Mitel certified, and you don't have to pick a Mitel certified carrier. Sure, it makes it easier, but as long as you're using a Mitel certified session border controller, then Mitel doesn't, even Inflow doesn't care what carrier you're using. But if you're not using a certified session border controller, then we want to make sure we have a certified carrier, because they're going to manage the session border controller and everything like that on their end. But every SIP carrier has a little bit different, settings, that they want set up. So sometimes it could take a little bit longer for us to figure out what settings we need to make sure we're passing caller ID or transfers and conferencing works correctly, to make sure that the handshake codes back and forth that are going back and forth are working properly. So sometimes it can take a little bit longer to get a SIP connection set up and working than a PRI. When I just plug it in, there's only a few settings I can change on the PRI. The biggest issue we run into with SIP is faxing. Faxing over a copper PRI is 98% great. When we start faxing over SIP, we're now sending our faxes over a data connection, which means it's IP packets, meaning if we have packet delay or packet loss, that's going to either have blank pages on the fax, or it's going to just error and the fax will cancel out. And then the fax machine on the whatever end is sending is going to do a retry, which means it starts the whole fax over again. Ways we can try to get the failure rate, less than 15%. So I would say 10 to 15% is typical failure rate for SIP faxing. The longer the faxes, the higher the failure rate. So if you're faxing 1 and 2 page faxes only, you're probably going to see a lot less. You're probably going to see a failure rate closer to like 5%. But if you're a medical facility, you're faxing an 80-page medical record, you're probably going to see closer to the 10 to 15% failure rate on those longer faxes. So how can we correct make that less? We need to make sure that the carrier that's going to be doing the faxing supports T38. It's a codec specifically designed for faxing. If they support that, the session border controller supports that, and the ShoreGear switches that we're utilizing support it, which everything on that list that I showed earlier supports T38. Any of the half-width switches support T38. So the ones that don't support it are end of life now. So most customers if they haven't already pulled them out, they're planning to pull those out of service. So any of the half-width switches support T38 from a ShoreTel Mitel perspective. But what we're seeing, once we have T38 enabled on, there's the PBX side, the SBC side, and the carrier side, then we'll see that failure rate go down between say 5 and 8% on average. So still more than a traditional PRI, but significantly better than the 15%, without T38 codec enabled. So that's usually our biggest thing. Other ways you can get around that, some customers are just going to like a cloud-based fax server, which takes all the faxing off of your local network and everything. Or some customers who do a ton of faxing might still use some analog lines connected to physical fax machines, to kind of get around faxing over SIP with just some analog lines connected directly to those fax machines. A lot of our medical customers, if they have a fax server connected to like their medical record system, a lot of those systems are just actually connected to a few analog lines, so they can do automatic outbound faxing via analog lines, which is very reliable. But analog lines are becoming more and more expensive, so some customers want to get away from that. So from a session border controller, these are the current certified session border controller. I pulled this morning from Mitel. Ingate's been around for a long time. Mitel, ShoreTel back, had a good relationship with Ingate. There's a lot of configuration stuff to the Ingate, so we're not huge fans of them. We have customers that have them. Our preference is the AdTran. From a cost, Ingate for the smaller session border controllers, Ingate is more cost effective for smaller, if you only need 10 or 20 SIP trunks. AdTran is US-based company, US-based tech support and stuff like that. Significantly easier to configure and support. So we typically, we're going to recommend AdTran if it's something that you're going to want Inflow's help maybe maintaining or supporting. We will recommend an AdTran in most cases. Other ones, Audio Codes, Sonos are big brands. The Frafos is a brand new one. They were recently certified with Mitel. I haven't heard of them before. I put them on here, but it's a newer SBC to me. Audio Codes is really good for integrations with other systems like Skype for Business, Teams, that kind of stuff. Audio Codes kind of dominates that market with big integrations. But like I said, we recommend the carrier provides the SBC if they can for you. Most carriers offer that, and if they don't, these would be the session border controllers that we're going to recommend picking from one of the certified. That way, if we have a configuration issue and our engineering team can't resolve it, we do have the option of pulling in a Mitel engineer and saying, hey, we have a certified session border controller and we can't get it to connect or work properly. So on this list, we sell AdTran, Audio Codes, and Ingate. We don't sell the other two at this point. All right, I think I answered all the questions. The one question is carrier recommendations. So, we have a couple carriers that we work with on a regular basis. Typically, we tell the customers, you're free to use any carrier you want if they're using a certified session border controller. If you do want, there is a Mitel Solutions Alliance list of certified carriers that that you can access from the Mitel website, or we can send over to you if you want a list of carriers. You can also reach out to your account manager, your CSM, or your AE, and they'll be more than happy to, just talk through a list of carriers or that we've worked with ourselves, or that are certified for Mitel when it comes to that, carrier. We typically recommend getting 2 or 3 quotes from carriers just to make sure you're getting a good deal on your SIP trunking. Not your current carrier that you're with isn't always going to give you the best deal, so we're more than happy to give you a recommendation on 1 or 2 carriers to, to price compare them against as well. So thanks for joining today. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to email us or call us. We're more than happy to hop on a call, grab your account manager and grab a sales engineer and talk through your existing setup. We can look at, how many concurrent trunks you're using, and kind of give you recommendation on the number of SIP trunks and the type of architecture and stuff that we should do for SIP trunking on your particular system. We're more than happy to hop on those calls. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we're more than happy to assist. Look forward to seeing everybody on a future webinar, and thanks and have a good day.